When 5 men who helped control the destiny of thousands suddenly disappeared from a locked meeting room, they left behind only their cigars, still slowly burning, and a single word carved deep into the heavy mahogany table. The question was not only where they had gone. The real question was what they had uncovered in the weeks before that made someone or something decide they could never be allowed to speak again. Charleston, 1844. A city built on secrets that even the soil itself seemed desperate to keep hidden beneath its surface. The invitation arrived on October 14, 1844. It was delivered by a private courier to 5 of Charleston's most powerful plantation owners. Each envelope carried the same dark crimson wax seal, marked with a ship's anchor twisted together with cotton bolls. Inside were identical cards, printed on thick cream-colored paper of the finest quality. The message was short and direct. A matter of shared urgency requires immediate consultation. October 23rd, 8:00 in the evening. The Wellington Club, Private Chamber 3. Attendance is not optional. Burn this invitation. There was no signature and no explanation. Colonel James Hartley received his letter at breakfast. At 62 years old, he owned 4 plantations stretching across 3 counties, with nearly 800 enslaved people forced to work his land. His cotton empire had made him one of the richest men in South Carolina. The aging colonel turned the card over slowly in his weathered hands, studying it with the careful focus he had learned during his years of military service. He did not burn it. Thomas Brennan, 38 and ambitious, read his invitation in his private study while reviewing financial ledgers. His plantation was smaller than Hartley's, but his improvements in cotton processing had attracted attention from textile manufacturers in England. He was the kind of man who believed the future belonged to those bold enough to grab it. The invitation troubled him, not because it was mysterious, but because he could not figure out who had sent it. In Charleston's close social circles, true anonymity was almost impossible. Richard Ashby, 45, was known for his detailed record-keeping. Everything that happened on his 2 plantations was carefully written in leather-bound journals that he personally maintained. When his invitation arrived, he immediately began forming a mental list of who might have sent it and for what reason. The anchor and cotton seal was unfamiliar, which was unusual. Ashby knew every important family crest and business seal in the region. William Foster, 51, was perhaps the most respected of the 5. His family had lived in Charleston for 3 generations. His approach to plantation management was considered progressive by the standards of that time, though it was still built on the same system of forced labor that had made all their fortunes possible. Foster kept private journals that he never shared, writings that suggested a man struggling with contradictions he could not fully resolve. The youngest was Marcus Landry, only 33, who had inherited his father's plantation just 2 years earlier. He still carried the nervous energy of new wealth, always worried about making errors that might cost him his place among Charleston's elite society. The invitation made him uneasy in ways he could not clearly explain. None of the 5 men burned their invitations, despite the clear instruction. Over the next 9 days, each of them quietly tried to discover who had sent the strange summons. They made careful and discreet inquiries among trusted friends. They studied the quality of the paper, the printing style, the composition of the wax seal. Brennan even consulted a professional printer who confirmed that the cardstock was costly European paper that had been recently imported. The Wellington Club stood on Meeting Street, an exclusive establishment where Charleston's wealthiest men gathered for drinks, cigars, and the kind of private business conversations that shaped the region's entire economy. Private Chamber 3 was located on the 2nd floor. It was a room used for confidential meetings. It had no windows facing the street. Thick velvet curtains lined the interior walls for soundproofing. The door could be locked only from the inside, a feature that gave the room its reputation for complete privacy and discretion. On the morning of October 23rd, Colonel Hartley mentioned the invitation to his wife during breakfast. She noticed he seemed distracted and distant. He told her not to wait up for him that night, that he might return late. He did not tell her that he had been sleeping poorly for several nights or that he had started checking the locks on doors and windows around the house with unusual care. Thomas Brennan's wife noticed that her husband had begun carrying a small pistol in his coat pocket, something he had never done before. When she asked him about it, he brushed aside her concern and changed the subject. But she saw the way his eyes kept moving toward the windows, as if he expected to see someone standing outside watching. Richard Ashby spent the afternoon of the 23rd burning papers in the fireplace of his study. His wife heard him and found it strange. Her husband never destroyed documents. Through the closed door, she heard him speaking softly to himself, though she could not understand the words. William Foster visited his family's church that same afternoon. The rector would later remember that Foster seemed as though he wanted to speak about something serious, but could not find the courage or the language. He knelt in prayer for nearly an hour alone in the empty sanctuary. Marcus Landry wrote a letter to his sister that morning. He sealed it carefully and left instructions with his household staff that it should only be opened if something happened to him. The letter would later disappear before anyone had the chance to read it. October 23, 1844 arrived gray and cold. A thick fog rolled in from Charleston Harbor, heavy and stubborn, muting sounds and reducing visibility to only a few yards. Local residents said such fog was unusual for that season. It gave the city a strange feeling, as if Charleston had become cut off from the rest of the world, trapped in its own quiet pocket of time. By evening, the fog had grown even heavier. Street lamps cast weak circles of light that barely broke through the gray mist. Carriage drivers moved slowly, guiding their horses more by memory than by sight. The streets felt emptier than usual. The Wellington Club's doorman, a free black man named Henry Webb, kept careful records of every arrival and departure. It was part of his duties. His logbook would later become very important. Colonel Hartley arrived first at 7:47 p.m. Webb noted that the colonel appeared tense, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. Hartley went straight to the second floor without pausing in the main parlor. Thomas Brennan arrived at 7:52 p.m., alone, though he paused outside the entrance as if speaking quietly to someone before coming in. Webb wrote this detail down, and it would later confuse investigators. Richard Ashby came at 7:55 p.m., carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. Webb noted, "He held it tightly and would not allow me to take it." William Foster arrived at 7:58 p.m., and Webb recorded that Foster asked whether the others had already arrived and seemed relieved when told they had. Marcus Landry was the last to arrive, stepping through the door at exactly 8:01 p.m. Webb wrote that the young man looked pale and asked if anyone unusual had been seen near the building that evening. 5 men entered the club and were noted in the log. They all proceeded upstairs to private chamber 3. The door was solid mahogany with a brass lock. It could only be secured from the inside. There was no other entrance or hidden exit. At 8:03 p.m., Webb heard the lock turn firmly into place from within the chamber. That evening, 11 other club members were present throughout the building. Several would later report hearing the low sound of voices coming from private chamber 3 around 8:15 p.m. The voices were not loud enough to understand, but the tone suggested serious discussion. The club manager, Edmund Price, passed by the room at approximately 8:30 p.m. He confirmed hearing multiple voices engaged in what sounded like an intense conversation. At 9:17 p.m., the sound stopped completely. Several club members later spoke about how sudden and total the silence felt. It was the kind of silence that forces itself into your awareness. One member, Judge Theodore Harrison, said he had been reading quietly in the library when he suddenly realized he could hear his own heartbeat. That was how still the building had become. By 10:45 p.m., Henry Webb grew uneasy. The 5 men had been inside for nearly 3 hours. He had seen no one enter or leave. He went upstairs and knocked on the door of private chamber 3. There was no reply. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out. Still nothing. Webb went to get Edmund Price. Together, they knocked repeatedly and called through the door. It remained locked from the inside. They could see a thin line of light beneath the door. The lamps inside were still burning, yet there was no sound at all. Price made a decision. At 11:03 p.m., he sent for a locksmith named Jonathan Miller, who lived only 3 blocks away. Miller arrived at 11:34 p.m. with his tools. He examined the door carefully. The lock had indeed been turned from inside. Someone had deliberately secured it. He worked slowly and carefully, wanting to avoid damaging club property. Finally, at 11:52 p.m., he managed to open the lock. Edmund Price pushed the door open. The room was empty. 5 oil lamps still burned steadily, their wicks properly trimmed with enough fuel to last for hours. 5 chairs were pushed back from the table, positioned as if their occupants had stood up quickly. 5 glasses of brandy rested on the table, barely touched. 5 cigars lay in ashtrays. 4 had burned completely to ash. One, Colonel Hartley's cigar, was still smoking, a thin line of gray drifting upward toward the ceiling. The single window in the room was closed and locked from inside. The glass was unbroken. It had been painted shut years earlier and was never opened. The walls were solid beneath the heavy velvet curtains. The hardwood floor showed no loose boards, no trapdoors. The plaster ceiling above was smooth and undamaged. 5 men had entered. The door had been locked from inside. Now they were gone. But something remained. Carved into the surface of the mahogany table, the fresh cuts revealing pale wood beneath the dark polish, was a single word. The letters were rough and deeply gouged, as if carved with force and urgency. Beneath that word were what appeared to be numbers, but they had been scratched over again and again, making them impossible to read clearly. Around those numbers, someone had carved a long series of marks that looked like tally marks, hundreds of them, covering nearly 2 feet of the table's surface. Edmund Price stood frozen, his face drained of color. Henry Webb, standing just behind him, would later tell investigators that the room felt wrong. Not cold, not dark, just wrong in a way he could not properly describe. It felt like stepping into a place where something terrible had just occurred, yet nothing in the room appeared disturbed. Everything sat exactly where it should have been, except for the simple and impossible fact that 5 powerful men had vanished without a trace. Except for the 5 men who were supposed to be there. Price quickly sent Webb to notify the authorities at once. By 12:30 a.m. on October 24th, Charleston's Chief Constable, Daniel Rutherford, arrived at the Wellington Club accompanied by 4 officers. Rutherford was a careful and systematic man, well experienced in handling the city's different crimes and public troubles. Still, he had never faced anything like this before. His investigation started without delay. Every small detail was carefully written down. The room measured 16 feet by 20 feet. There were no hidden corridors, no loose panels, nothing unusual in the walls. The single window was locked from the inside and had been painted shut with several thick layers that clearly had not been opened for many years. Paint chips on the sill confirmed this fact. The door had been locked from the inside, with the key still in the lock. There were no other exits. The 5 cigars were inspected closely. 4 had burned completely into ash. Colonel Hartley's cigar was still giving off smoke when they entered, which meant it had been lit within the last 10 to 15 minutes. Yet the men had been inside that locked room for more than 3 hours. The brandy was examined and later tested. There was nothing strange about it. No signs of poison, no drugs, nothing unusual. The carved word reckoning and the tally marks beneath it were carefully recorded. Later, a furniture expert confirmed that the cuts were fresh and had been made only a few hours earlier. Personal belongings were still there. Colonel Hartley's pocket watch lay on the table, still ticking steadily. Thomas Brennan's leather gloves rested neatly on his chair. Richard Ashby's portfolio remained closed on the table. Inside were financial papers and plantation records, nothing out of the ordinary. William Foster's walking stick leaned quietly against the wall. Marcus Landry's hat hung from the coat rack. Men do not simply disappear and leave their hats behind. Rutherford questioned everyone who had been in the building that evening. 11 club members and 3 staff members, including Webb and Price, were interviewed. The locksmith stated firmly that no one could have exited the room while it was locked from the inside. No one had seen the five men leave. No one had heard anything unusual after 9:17 p.m., the time when the voices stopped. The investigation widened. Officers were sent to the homes of each missing man. In the early hours of October 24th, the households of the five men were visited. What Constable Rutherford's officers found only made the mystery deeper. At Colonel Hartley's residence, they discovered his study in disorder. Books had been pulled from the shelves and papers were scattered across his desk. However, his wife, Ella Lenina, insisted that everything had been normal when she had last seen him. She guided the officers into the study, and her confusion appeared real and sincere. She had been in that room earlier that afternoon, and it had been perfectly arranged. The colonel had always been strict and precise about his workspace. More troubling was what they discovered in the fireplace of the study. There were partially burned letters, many of them. The officers carefully removed what remained. Most were too damaged to read clearly, but a few pieces survived. One letter addressed to the colonel had a single readable sentence. They know about the shipment from March. Someone kept records. The rest had turned to ash. Elena Hartley said she had never seen these letters before and knew nothing about any shipment. When questioned further, she mentioned that her husband had grown distant over the past 3 weeks, since around October 1st. He had stopped sleeping properly. She would wake during the night and find him standing by their bedroom window at strange hours, watching the street below. He seemed frightened, she told the officers, though he would never openly admit such fear. At Thomas Brennan's home, officers found his wife Catherine deeply upset and shaken. She led them to his study where they noticed that a locked drawer in his desk had been forced open from the inside. The wood was splintered and the lock had broken outward. The drawer itself was empty. Catherine insisted that her husband had been the only person with a key to that drawer, and she had never known him to damage his own furniture. When had this happened? She did not know. She had not stepped into his study since the morning before. In Brennan's bedroom, hidden beneath the mattress, officers found a loaded pistol and a hand-drawn map. The map showed Charleston Harbor and nearby waterways. Certain dates were written beside specific locations. March 14th, April 3rd, June 22nd, August 15th. There was no explanation about what those dates meant or why they were marked. Richard Ashby's wife, Margaret, remained calmer than the others, though her worry was clear in her expression. She led officers into her husband's study where they found his well-known journals, years of detailed records covering nearly every part of his plantation business. 37 leather-bound volumes were arranged in order on the shelves, except one was missing. Margaret noticed it immediately. The journal covering March through September of 1844 was gone. Richard had been writing in it just last week. She had personally seen it resting on his desk. Now it was nowhere to be found in the study, and Richard would never have removed it from that room. He was very strict about keeping his journals organized and easy to reach. Officers searched the entire house carefully, but the missing journal was not located. What they did discover, hidden inside another journal from 1843, was a loose sheet of paper covered in Richard's handwriting. It seemed to list names, 47 names in total. All appeared to be names of enslaved individuals, though not from Ashby's own plantation. Next to each name was a single word, either sold or gone. The date written at the top of the page was March 18, 1844. At William Foster's home, his wife Julia waited anxiously for news, pale and trembling with worry. She told officers that her husband had been troubled for months, though he refused to explain why. He had been writing late into the night, burning candles until morning light. In his study, they found his private journal, the one Julia mentioned he kept locked and separate from household records. It was lying open on his desk as if he had been reading it recently. The last entry was dated October 22nd, the day before he disappeared. I can no longer stay silent. What we have done, what all of us have done, demands a response. The others think we can hide this the same way we have hidden everything else. But some things refuse to stay buried. Tomorrow we meet to discuss the terms. I plan to tell them that I am going to the authorities. May God forgive me for waiting so long. Earlier entries were equally unclear, mentioning the agreement, the arrangement, and what happened in March. Foster wrote about guilt, about sleepless nights, about faces he could not forget no matter how hard he tried. Marcus Landry's home was perhaps the most disturbing of all. His household staff reported that young Mr. Landry had grown increasingly fearful during the past 2 weeks. He had hired extra guards to patrol the property at night. He had started locking himself inside his bedroom. The sealed letter he had written to his sister that very morning was missing. No one knew where it had been placed, and no one could locate it. Inside Landry's bedroom, officers found something that caused them to exchange uneasy looks. There were scratch marks on the inside of his bedroom door. Deep marks carved into the wood, as if someone had clawed at it in panic. The marks were fresh. Yet the door opened easily and was neither locked nor jammed. Why would someone claw at a door that opened freely without resistance? On the bedside table lay a Bible open to Revelation 20. One single verse had been underlined so hard that the pen had torn through the page, and the sea gave up the dead which were in it. Constable Rutherford directed the investigation from the Wellington Club, which had been closed off as a crime scene. By sunrise on October 24th, he had gathered his first conclusions. 5 men had vanished from a locked room. There was no clear explanation for their disappearance. However, the evidence found at their homes suggested they had all been connected in some shared matter, something that began in March of 1844 and had troubled them ever since. The same dates kept appearing. March 14th, March 18th. Something important had taken place during that month. Rutherford was a practical and realistic man. He was not one to believe in superstition or strange tales. He did not believe that 5 grown men had simply faded into thin air. They had left that room somehow, and he intended to find out how. But as he continued questioning witnesses and collecting more proof, his confidence slowly began to weaken. The architectural plans of the club were examined carefully. There were no secret tunnels, no hidden doors forgotten over time. The building had been constructed in 1798 and renovated in 1832. All records were available and every change had been documented properly. Private Chamber 3 was exactly what it appeared to be, a simple rectangular room with one door, one window, and nothing concealed within its walls.
Whitfield shifted uneasily before answering. Officially, cotton and tobacco bound for Liverpool, but there were rumors that the Meridian carried other cargo as well, cargo that was never officially recorded. In 1844, the international slave trade had been illegal in the United States for many years, but illegal business still took place, smuggled quietly and hidden carefully, especially in southern ports where enforcement was weak and many officials chose not to see. The domestic slave trade was still legal and highly profitable, but bringing enslaved people from overseas was supposed to have ended. "You are saying the Meridian was involved in slave smuggling?" Rutherford asked carefully. "I am saying there were rumors," Whitfield replied. "Nothing proven, but dock workers talked. They claimed the Meridian had come from West Africa, stopped somewhere in the Caribbean, then sailed to Charleston. They said the ship sat too low in the water for the cargo it claimed to carry. They said it left suddenly in the middle of the night without following the usual procedures." "Why would these 5 plantation owners be concerned about that?" Rutherford asked. Whitfield met the constable's eyes directly. "Because they were the investors, sir." Word among the dock workers was that the Meridian's voyage had been funded by a group of Charleston planters. The ship was meant to bring them cargo they could no longer obtain legally. But something went wrong. Rutherford felt a cold realization settle deep inside him. "What went wrong?" he asked quietly. "The ship arrived almost empty, sir. Whatever cargo it was supposed to be carrying, it was not there. The investors lost a massive fortune. But more than the money, there were disturbing stories about what happened to the crew. The Meridian left Charleston with 14 crew members. When it returned, there were only 6. The captain refused to explain what happened to the others. He refused to say anything at all. He collected his payment for the voyage and vanished. The ship sailed out that same night and never came back to Charleston. That changed everything. Changed. Rutherford immediately started pulling port records. The Meridian had truly docked in Charleston in March. Its manifest listed cotton and tobacco. The ship was registered out of Baltimore, owned by a trading company that, after investigation, proved to be a shell company with no real offices and no traceable owners. The 6 crew members who had returned with the ship scattered quickly. Rutherford sent officers to find them. 3 were located inside Charleston, working as dock laborers, taking whatever jobs they could get. All 3 refused to speak about the Meridian or its voyage. One became so upset during questioning that he pulled a knife and had to be restrained. Between shouting and swearing, he said only one clear sentence: "What's done is done." The sea took what it was owed, and the rest is not for talking about. The other 2 crew members were slightly more willing to answer, but only just. Yes, they had sailed on the Meridian. Yes, the voyage had gone badly. No, they would not share details. When pressed about the missing crew members, both men showed visible fear. One kept crossing himself and whispering prayers under his breath. The other simply walked away, and no amount of legal pressure could bring him back for more questions. The remaining 3 crew members had disappeared completely. They left Charleston shortly after the Meridian departed and had not been seen again. Rutherford obtained the ship's official log from port records, but it was nearly useless. It contained only basic entries, the bare minimum required. There was nothing about the true nature of the voyage or what had actually happened. The captain's name was recorded as Samuel Garrett, a name that appeared nowhere else in shipping records before or after the Meridian's visit to Charleston. The man had vanished just as completely as the 5 plantation owners. But now, Rutherford had dates. The Meridian arrived on March 13th. Based on the evidence found in the missing men's homes, something important happened between March 14th and March 18th. That was when everything changed for them. That was when their fear began. On October 28th, 5 days after the disappearances, a man came forward with information. His name was Benjamin Cole, and he worked as a clerk at the Charleston Custom House, responsible for processing import documents. Cole was nervous, sweating even though the weather was cool. He told Constable Rutherford that he had been debating for days whether to come forward, afraid of losing his job or possibly something worse. There was paperwork, Cole said quietly while sitting in Rutherford's office, paperwork about the Meridian that did not go through the normal process. "Explain," Rutherford said firmly. Cole swallowed hard. On March 15th, Richard Ashby came to the Custom House. Not to the main desk. He came directly to me. He asked if we could speak privately. He knew I handled certain sensitive documents, papers that sometimes needed to be processed quietly. "You are saying he bribed you?" "Yes, sir." Cole's voice barely rose above a whisper. "He paid me to speed up clearance for the Meridian, to ignore certain inspection rules, and to make sure the ship could leave port without the usual delays. He paid me $200, sir. That is more than I earn in 4 months. $200 in 1844 was serious money, enough to make a man look the other way." "Did Ashby say why?" Rutherford asked. "No, sir. But he was frightened. I could see it in his eyes. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he believed someone might catch him speaking to me. He said the ship needed to leave as quickly as possible, that every hour it stayed in port was dangerous." "Dangerous in what way?" He did not explain. But he handed me a sealed envelope and told me that if anything happened to him, I should open it. He said it contained information that might matter one day. Rutherford straightened in his chair. "Where is this envelope now?" Cole reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed paper marked with Ashby's wax seal. I kept it hidden at home. When I heard he had disappeared, I knew I had to bring it to you. Rutherford broke the seal and began reading the letter inside. His expression slowly changed as he read, becoming harder and more troubled. When he finished, he read it again carefully. Then he set it down and looked at Cole. "You must not speak of this to anyone," Rutherford said. "Do you understand? Not to your wife, not to your friends, not to anyone." "Yes, sir." "What does it say?" "It says enough," Rutherford replied quietly. "Go home, Mr. Cole. Thank you for your honesty." After Cole left, Rutherford remained alone in his office, reading Ashby's letter for a third time. The contents were serious and deeply troubling. "If you are reading this, something has happened to me. I write this as both a confession and a record. In January 1844, 5 of us, myself, Colonel James Hartley, Thomas Brennan, William Foster and Marcus Landry, entered into an agreement to finance a voyage. We intended to obtain cargo through methods that had become illegal. We believed we could avoid the law through careful planning and silence. We hired a ship, the Meridian, and a captain willing to sail to West Africa. The ship departed in December 1843 with 14 crew members. It was expected to return by February with cargo we would divide among ourselves. The ship returned on March 13, 1844, but everything had gone terribly wrong. The cargo was gone, all of it. 147 souls lost in some way. The captain refused to give a clear explanation. The crew that returned was half the number that had left, and those who remained were changed, troubled, broken in spirit. The captain told us there had been a storm, that the cargo hold had flooded, that they had done everything possible. But his eyes told a different story. We paid him anyway. We had no choice. We needed him and his crew to stay silent about our involvement. The ship left that night. We believed it was over, that we could accept the financial loss and be grateful we had avoided legal punishment. But we were wrong. Strange events began happening soon after. Each of us received anonymous letters describing details of the voyage that no one outside the crew should have known. Messages were left at our homes, carved into trees on our land, whispered by people we could not identify. Always the same message. Someone knows what we did. More disturbing were the sightings. All 5 of us have seen them. Figures at night standing at the edges of our properties. When we moved closer, they disappeared, but we saw them clearly enough to recognize the faces of the cargo we tried to buy, the faces of people who died because of our greed. I do not ask for forgiveness. I ask only that the truth be known. If something happens to me, investigate the Meridian. Investigate March 1844. What we did demands payment. The letter was signed and dated October 20th, 3 days before Ashby vanished. Rutherford sat in the deepening darkness of his office, the letter still in his hands. He was beginning to understand what had happened, or at least the shape of it. 5 men had financed an illegal slave trading voyage. The voyage had ended in disaster, leading to the deaths of 147 enslaved people and 8 crew members. The investors believed they could bury the truth by paying off the survivors and letting the ship disappear. But someone had known. Someone had been sending them messages, haunting them, pushing them toward some final reckoning. The word carved into the table, reckoning, and the tally marks beside it. Rutherford counted them carefully in his notes. There were 147 clear marks carved into the wood, the same number as the lost cargo. Someone had arranged the disappearance of the 5 men, but who and how had they vanished from a locked room? As October turned into November, the investigation grew stronger. Rutherford's team questioned hundreds of people, dock workers, sailors, plantation laborers, anyone who might know something about the Meridian or the 5 missing men. Patterns slowly began to appear. Several enslaved people from the 5 plantations reported that their owners had grown increasingly paranoid in the weeks before they disappeared. Extra guards were hired. Punishments became harsher for small mistakes, as if the owners were trying to control others through fear because they themselves were terrified. Many reported seeing strangers on the properties at night, people who did not belong there walking quietly across the grounds after dark. When confronted, these strangers seemed to fade into the shadows. Guards described similar experiences, figures that appeared at a distance and seemed to melt away when chased. One woman named Ruth, enslaved on Hartley's plantation, told an investigator something chilling. On the night of October 22nd, the evening before the disappearances, she was awakened by singing. Multiple voices coming from somewhere beyond the main house, singing in languages she did not recognize. African languages, she believed, though not one she personally knew. The singing continued for hours and stopped just before sunrise. When she mentioned it to the overseer the next morning, he struck her and told her she had imagined it. But other enslaved people on Hartley's plantation confirmed hearing the same thing, singing in the night, in languages that felt both unfamiliar and strangely known. Similar reports came from the other 4 plantations. In the nights leading up to October 23rd, there were unexplained events. Singing, figures moving through the darkness, a feeling of pressure building, like a storm preparing to break. Rutherford questioned the families more deeply. Colonel Hartley's wife admitted that her husband had barely slept during the final week. He would pace the floors at night, staring out the windows toward the fields. He claimed he saw shapes standing near the tree line. When she looked, she saw nothing. He ordered extra lanterns placed around the property. He doubled the night watch. He kept a pistol close at hand even inside his own home. The same pattern appeared in the other households. Wives reported husbands who jumped at small noises, who believed they were being watched, who received letters they would not show anyone, and then burned in the fireplace. One servant reported seeing Thomas Brennan arguing loudly with someone in his study, though when the door was opened, the room was empty. Fear had taken root in all 5 homes. Whatever had followed the Meridian back from sea had not stayed silent. It had waited. And on October 23rd, something had finally happened inside that locked room, something that left behind only carved words, tally marks, and 5 men who were never seen again. In the week before he went missing, her husband had become deeply focused on locks. He walked through the entire house, checking every door and window, adding new locks, even hammering nails into some of the windows so they could not be opened. He moved his pistol from the study into his bedroom and kept it loaded on the nightstand beside him each night. He refused to explain what frightened him. He would not tell me what he feared, Elena Hartley said, but I saw it clearly in his eyes. He was truly afraid. Thomas Brennan's wife later shared that her husband had tried to reserve passage on a ship to England in the middle of October. He had planned to leave Charleston, maybe forever, but changed his decision at the very last moment. When she asked him the reason, he answered only, "Running will not help. It will follow us wherever we go." What was this it? He never explained. During the investigation, another strange detail came to light. On October 15th, all 5 men had received the same kind of package, delivered with no sender's name. Inside each parcel was sand, ordinary sand like the kind found along the shore. Mixed within that sand were small pieces of wood, rotted and worn by seawater, along with fragments of bone. These bone fragments were later confirmed by a medical examiner to be human. The meaning was impossible to ignore. The sea had taken the cargo, but pieces of it still remained. Someone had gathered those pieces and sent them back as a message. Rutherford followed every possible lead, no matter how unusual it seemed. He questioned mystics and root workers, individuals who claimed they understood spiritual matters. Most of them were frauds, but a few said things that disturbed him. An elderly woman named Adeline, respected in Charleston's black community for her wisdom, told him, "What goes into the water does not always stay there, Constable. Sometimes the water gives it back. Sometimes the dead walk back to shore seeking justice. They were denied." Rutherford did not believe in spirits or supernatural revenge. Still, he could not ignore the facts. 5 men responsible for the deaths of 147 people had disappeared in a way that made no logical sense. The timing, the symbols, and the impossible fact that they had vanished from a locked room all pointed towards something beyond an ordinary crime. On November 8th, Rutherford received news that brought his investigation to a sudden stop. A vessel had run aground near Charleston Harbor. A fishing crew spotted it at sunrise, stuck on a sandbar about a mile from shore. The ship looked old, broken, and partly underwater. Its name could barely be read along the hull: Meridian. Rutherford quickly gathered a team and traveled by boat to the sandbar where the Meridian rested. The ship was in terrible shape. The hull was cracked, the masts snapped, and the ropes hung in tangled knots. It appeared as though it had been battling violent storms for months or even years, even though it had sailed from Charleston only 8 months earlier. The smell was overwhelming. A mix of decay, salt water, and death, strong enough to make hardened men feel sick. The vessel sat low in the water, clearly leaking yet held steady by the sandbar. They boarded carefully, afraid the deck might collapse under their weight. The wood felt soft and rotten beneath their boots. Rutherford led 3 officers along with a ship's carpenter named Thomas Gray, who could judge the ship's condition. The main deck was a disaster. Crates had been broken open and were empty, barrels smashed, and everything covered in a thick layer of mud and decay. Yet there were no bodies, no sign of the crew, and no trace of the human cargo. They moved down into the hold. This was where enslaved people would have been kept during the voyage, chained tightly together in cruel and inhuman conditions. The hold was dark, lit only by the lanterns they carried. What they discovered there explained why the crew had returned so shattered. The space was filled with chains, shackles connected in rows, still locked, arranged exactly as they would have been to restrain human beings. But every set was empty. 147 sets of chains, all secured, all empty. How could anyone escape from locked shackles? How could 147 people free themselves at the same moment? Gray studied the restraints closely. "These were not picked," he said. "They were not forced open. They remain locked properly from the outside, yet there is no one in them." On the wooden walls of the hold were carvings, hundreds of scratches and words in different languages. Rutherford could not read most of them, but he recognized repeated shapes, possibly names, prayers, or records of those who had been held there. One message carved deeply into a beam was in English. It read, "The water answered." They searched the rest of the ship. Inside the captain's cabin, they located the true ship's log, not the cleaned version that had been submitted to the port authorities. The final entries were dated March 14th, 1844. Third day out of harbor. Storm struck last evening, worst in 30 years at sea. Cargo hold flooded before we could secure it. Water rose so quickly as if the ocean meant to swallow the ship. When we opened the hold, they were gone. All of them. 147 people and not one body. Chains still locked. Hold filled with seawater but empty of bodies. Crew frightened. They claim the sea took them as payment for what we were doing. I call it superstition, yet I cannot explain it. We have lost Johnson, Peters, Mackenzie, Walsh, Davis, Montgomery, Pike, and Reed, swept overboard, or so I believed. But Matthews says he saw Johnson below deck this morning, standing in the flooded hold with water up to his chest. When called to, he did not answer. He only stared, then slowly sank beneath the water and vanished. The log ended there. The Meridian had somehow returned to Charleston months ago with its surviving crew, only to disappear again and now reappear in this broken condition. Rutherford's team searched every part of the ship. In the crew quarters, they found clothes, tools, and personal belongings, all coated in that same layer of decay. Near the captain's cabin, in a small locker wrapped in oilcloth and strangely preserved, they found 5 leather pouches. Each pouch was filled with gold coins, payment given by the 5 investors to ensure silence. Carved into each pouch was a name: Hartley, Brennan, Ashby, Foster, Landry. The money they had paid to hide their crime had returned with the ship. Rutherford stood on the deck of the Meridian as the sun lowered over Charleston Harbor and felt the truth settle heavily in his mind. 5 men had financed a voyage of human trafficking. 147 people had died as a result, drowned in a flooded hold, their names never recorded. The crew had been paid to keep quiet. The investors believed they had escaped punishment. Yet someone had known. Someone had sent warnings and built toward the night of October 23rd, when all 5 gathered in a locked room and disappeared. Rutherford had no logical explanation for how they vanished. But standing on that ship of death, feeling it sink deeper into the sand as if trying to return to the sea, he sensed that some crimes demanded answers beyond the reach of the law. The Meridian was towed to Charleston's naval yard and secured. Rutherford filed his detailed report with city authorities, explaining everything he had uncovered. The case of the 5 missing plantation owners was officially labeled unsolved, though Rutherford clearly stated his belief that their disappearance was directly tied to their funding of the illegal slave voyage that ended in 147 deaths. The loss of 5 well-known plantation owners shook Charleston society. Their families demanded explanations, threatened lawsuits, and hired private investigators. Experts from cities as far away as Boston inspected the locked room at the Wellington Club. Engineers, architects, even a stage magician who specialized in exposing fake spiritualists examined it carefully. None could explain how 5 men left a room locked from the inside, leaving behind only their belongings and a cigar still smoking. The table carved with the word "reckoning" and marked with 147 tally lines was preserved as evidence. The Wellington Club eventually sealed the room permanently because members felt uneasy about entering it. The widows soon faced financial troubles. The money invested in the Meridian was lost. Legal claims against the ship's owners failed when the company dissolved into nothing. The courts ruled the families had no legal path to recover their funds. Quietly, different stories spread through Charleston's enslaved communities. Tales of powerful men who had trafficked human lives and were forced to answer for it. The details varied, but the message stayed the same. Justice can exist beyond the laws written by men. In December 1844, the Meridian sank at its mooring in the naval yard. There was no storm and no visible damage. It simply settled into the water during the night and was gone by morning. Attempts to raise it did not succeed. It remains buried beneath harbor mud, a silent marker for 147 lives never properly recorded. Through the winter of 1844 and into 1845, investigators continued searching for the missing men. No bodies surfaced. No reliable witnesses appeared. It was as if the men had been removed from the world entirely. Benjamin Cole, the custom house clerk, died in February 1845, found drowned in shallow water near the docks. The official ruling called it an accident, though suspicion remained. Some believed he had been silenced. Others believed guilt had destroyed him. The 3 surviving crew members who had once been found in Charleston left the city soon after the ship reappeared and were never traced again. Records suggest they changed their names and vanished into distant ports, trying to escape whatever followed them. Years later, in 1852, a sailor in Boston named William Thatcher lay dying of pneumonia. Before his death, he confessed to a priest that he had served aboard the Meridian in March 1844. He described the storm, the flooding hold, and the impossible disappearance of the chained people. He added something new. After the storm, the remaining crew shared terrible dreams each night. They dreamed of drowning, of being chained in darkness as water slowly rose. They woke gasping for air, convinced they were truly drowning. Some mornings they found seawater in their bunks, even though the ship was dry under clear skies. Thatcher said the crew believed the 147 souls were still with the vessel, part of it, watching and waiting. The priest sent this confession to authorities in Charleston, but by then 8 years had passed. The case was cold. Rutherford had retired. No one pursued it further. The families of the missing men eventually rebuilt their lives. Widows remarried. Children grew up. Plantations were sold or managed by others. Time covered the past beneath layers of new days, yet the story remained alive in Charleston. The incident at the Wellington Club became a local legend. Students at the College of Charleston studied it as an unsolved mystery. Journalists occasionally reopened the case, hoping for new clues, but none appeared. In the spring of 1846, a traveler named Frederick Bailey passed through Charleston. He would later be known to history by another name. He quietly gathered stories, including the account of 5 plantation owners who vanished. Enslaved people from their plantations spoke with him in secret. They told him of singing heard at night before the disappearances, of figures seen walking the grounds after dark, and of a woman named Eliza who worked in Hartley's kitchen. On the morning after the men vanished, she stood at the edge of the property staring toward Charleston with tears on her face. When asked what troubled her, she answered softly, "They came back. They found what they were seeking." She would not explain further, yet she seemed calm, almost relieved, as though a heavy burden had lifted. Bailey recorded these stories privately. Years later he would briefly mention Charleston and masters swallowed by their own sins, but he left out the details. Perhaps he understood that some truths were too dangerous to write openly in a time when slavery still ruled and power defended itself. What truly happened on October 23, 1844, inside Private Chamber 3 of the Wellington Club remains unknown. 5 men entered a locked room and were never seen again. Their fate became one of Charleston's deepest mysteries. Yet perhaps the mystery itself carries meaning. Perhaps it is not about what happened to 5 guilty men, but about what their disappearance represented. Some debts demand payment. Some crimes cannot be buried or silenced with money. Justice may take forms that cannot be stopped by locked doors, wealth, or unjust laws. The Meridian still rests beneath Charleston Harbor, hidden under mud and years of time, and the story continues to echo like the sound of waves against the shore, reminding those who listen that not every wrong remains unanswered.